Yeah, well, it's 50
It
days.
moves, yeah.
Yeah, it moves, yeah. 50 days after Easter.
Oh. Okay. So we're going to do a little recap because somebody hasn't been here on the last couple of Sundays. So quick recap. Paul, second missionary journey, basically going back through checking on the churches that he started on the first, or that the Holy Spirit started on the first missionary journey. And one of the places he stops by is Thessalonica. I can now say for a fact that it is Thessalonica because I looked it up.
Okay.
I've decided that I'm going to start looking up some of the names of these places
More
that I
difficult
can't.
names.
Yeah, because I wouldn't pronounce it that way. When I see it as Thessalonica, that's an American way to say it, or I could say it, Thessalonica, which is the Texas way to pronounce it. But yes, no, it's Thessalonica.
Yeah, that's okay.
And the emphasis is on the nigh. So, or as we would say it in Texas, Thessalonica. Those folks in Thessalonica, they're just so sweet. They're just so nice. Actually, they weren't. They weren't. Because that's the place where situation got so tense, so bad, that the Jews stirred up the crowd in the town square, which is where there were a bunch of roustabouts waiting to be employed, a bunch of unemployed people waiting for somebody to come along and give them a job. And probably, if they're anything like, the roustabouts of today, they were probably imbibing some adult beverages while they were waiting around. I can comfortably say that they weren't smoking any cigarettes because they didn't have them back then, as far as I know. They didn't have tobacco in that area. But, they were your typical roustabouts waiting for something to do. And when a bunch of well-to-do Jews came along and said, "There he is, get him!" Sure, why not? We're bored anyway, let's get him. And so the situation was so tense that the brothers, the Christians, those who had been converted, those who were part of the church in Thessalonica, just saying. Anyway, it says in the text, immediately got Paul on a ship that was headed to Athens. I'm not even sure if they knew where the ship was going.
They just got on the ship.
Because they just got him, and to point out how immediate the threat was. And when they say immediately, they're not kidding. It's like, right now, go. They were not able to get Silas or Timothy on there. They sent Paul off alone, and Silas and Timothy were left behind. That's how immediate the threat was. Now, how do we know that Silas and Timothy didn't say, no, we shall stay behind and face the threat ourselves. Go, my lord, quickly. Is because once he got to Athens, Paul immediately sent back and said, go get Silas and Timothy and bring them to Athens with me. So Paul gets dropped off at Athens. He has a 3-mile trek from the seaport where he was dropped off to actual Athens proper. Okay, and as he's walking along, he notices just a whole bunch of temples and idols. Let me tell you something about Athens, and I said this last week, but somebody wasn't here. Athens was dedicated to philosophy. At this point in time, philosophy was the thing. Okay? Philosophy was it. But prior to that, it was dedicated to religion. Which religion? All of them. That's like the old joke when what's his name? Sylvester Stallone asked Chuck Norris, "How many push-ups can you do?" And Chuck Norris looked back at him and said, "All of them." Yeah. Athens was devoted to all of them. And we're going to get into how ridiculously they were dedicated to that in just a little bit after we get through with the recap that we apparently necessarily have to do because somebody wasn't here for the past couple of times. Anyway, not going to hear the end of that one, is she? So he's walking up there, and of course, he's walking into Athens. He sees the Acropolis, which is a temple, and he sees all of these temples everywhere. There's just a temple, and there's a shrine over here, and there's an idol over here, and all this kind of stuff, and that kind of stuff. Now, in the current time where he's walking through, the Greeks, the Athenians are much more, civilized now. And, of course we have these gods and so on and so forth, but we're much more dedicated to philosophy. And the philosophies at that time were, the point of the philosophies was to explain the natural and, depending on the philosophy, supernatural world. Okay? But it was more secular than anything else. Although, and again, you had there was the Athenian god, Athena, and the worship of Athena was pretty much mandatory. If you're from Athens, you worship Athena. And the Athenians, by the way, considered themselves to be super duper special, specialer than anybody else, which is not unusual. It's just not unusual. A lot of cultures referred to themselves as the people. That was actually a very common meaning in Native American tribes. All around the world, they refer to themselves as the people. Okay? There's an organization, a modern organization today in the United States that's a pseudo-political organization, an activist political organization for Mexican people of Mexican descent called La Raza, which means the race. So it's not uncommon. The Athenians considered themselves special. Everybody else does. When you're from a certain area, it's just kind of normal. The only people, of course, for whom that is true is those of us who are blessed enough to be from Pittsburgh. But anyway, that aside, so they've got all these different gods all over the place. And it said that Paul grieved in his spirit, little s. It alarmed him personally that this was going on. And so Paul, being Paul, he decided he was going to do something about it. So he first went to the synagogue, and then he went to the marketplace. Because the marketplace was where all the new up-and-coming philosophers tried to share their philosophies. Now, if you were a big, noted philosopher, then you had your own school. You had a building where people met so that you could teach your philosophy. But if you were one of the new up-and-coming, as I explained it last week, if you were one of the guys coming up in the minors, then you talked about your philosophy in the marketplace so that everybody could hear it. And then if it was compelling enough, you would go before the city council, and the city council would decide whether or not they liked your philosophy and whether or not it could be taught. Because there were a lot of people that would come through, and they just kind of spout off little bits of other people's ideas and stuff like that and kind of blend them together to try to make their own. Those individuals, there was actually an epithet that was used by the Athenians to describe these people. That epithet was called a babbler.
Yeah.
Okay? And what it meant was, it meant a peck, like a chicken pecking at the ground and picking up little seeds here and there from different places and then just spouting them off and not knowing what they were talking about. And that's originally what they had accused Paul of being when he was talking in the marketplace. The reason being is because Paul was talking about Jesus and his resurrection. The word for resurrection in Greek is anastasis, which is a female name, Anastasia.
Right.
And so they were thinking that he was talking about a god that had a male, that was a dual male and female, like two sides of a coin, which several of their ancient gods had that kind of thing. And so they thought he was trying to, bring up old stuff, and they didn't understand what he was talking about, so they brought him before the town council to find out what's going on. Now, the two major competing philosophies, as again, putting it in sports terms, like back in the 70s, you had the Celtics and you had the Lakers. Those were the two biggest, baddest basketball teams ever back in the 70s. Well, your two biggest, baddest philosophies at the time here were the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans believed, and I'm not going to get into their scientific beliefs, I went into that last week, but some people missed it, and I'm not going to recount that because it doesn't really matter that much. But the Epicureans believed these philosophies went down literally to molecular science. What the world is made up of. Okay, these weren't just ephemeral, out in the ethereal ideas that they were coming up with. And so these guys wanted to break down what the world was made up of, how do we perceive the world, that kind of stuff. And if you really want to get into this kind of thing, you can still look up Epicureanism. The Stoics, which were the other team, still exist today. They have their own website, the Daily Stoic. Yeah, they're still out there. It still exists. I myself, when I was in high school, I got fascinated with Greek philosophy, everything Greek really, the old myths and stuff like that. And then I started reading Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and that kind of stuff. And I've always been interested, but they would get into, what is the world made up of, down to the molecular level. They knew about atoms back then, even though they couldn't see them. They theorized about atoms and stuff, and a lot of the stuff that they theorized was correct. So anyway, but the overarching belief of the Epicureans is, yes, there were gods, but they don't have anything to do with the working of the world anymore. They create stuff and then they go on about their business, and so there's really not that much of a point in talking to them, sacrificing to them, or anything like that. It's okay if you want to build a statue to them and all that kind of stuff, but understand that statue doesn't really represent what that god looks like. It's just an artistic interpretation to remind us that god is there, even though that god doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing today. The only way that we can experience these gods directly, and this is very interesting, the only way we can experience these gods directly is to experience life and experience the pleasures of life. Now, this is different from hedonism, where hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure. Epicureanism is the appreciation of pleasure, and to the greatest extent possible, the avoidance of anything negative. Okay? But an Epicurean is a lot like what we call today like a foodie. like I'm starting to become. You appreciate a really good cup of coffee. You appreciate a really well-cooked meal. You know, while you're there in the moment, enjoy everything you can enjoy about that moment, because the moment's going to be gone eventually. So that's what Epicurean is. Now, the thing about being an Epicurean at that particular time is you had to be able to afford being an Epicurean. So the vast majority of Epicureans were rich folks. And of course, just like in any society ever in all of history, the vast majority of people in Athens were not rich folks. They couldn't afford to be Epicureans, but they could afford to be Stoics. And the Stoics originally were pantheistic, believed in all these different gods and so forth, but they themselves were moving in a secular direction at that particular time too. And they thought it was okay to go ahead and give, sacrifices to various gods and whatnot and so on and so forth. But pretty much, they were more about the brotherhood of man. And the Stoics' purpose is, there may be gods out there and so forth, but we can't control them. The only thing I can control is that which is actually in my sphere of influence, and so that's what I'm going to do. And the one thing that you can always control, that is always in your sphere of influence, is your personal attitude. And so you keep your attitude and your emotions in check, hence the term Stoic. Now, these weren't like Vulcans from Star Trek. They had emotions and so forth, but you had to, keep your emotions under control, keep your attitude under control, and only control that which you can control, and everything else is out of your control, so don't worry about it, kind of thing. Okay, and the vast majority of people could be Stoics. And the town council, even though they were all fairly well off, as you can imagine, the majority of the town council, or the Areopagus, were Stoics. You had, there were about 100 of them, 100 members of this group. Virtually all of them were men. Now, unlike Macedonia, where Paul just came from, in Macedonia, Greek women could have very, very prominent positions. In Athens, Greek women were pretty much secluded to the house, except for very high-class prostitutes, which were very public, because, well, that's kind of their job. You got to be out there to get the cash, as it were. And several of the gods, in order to worship that particular god, you had to have sex. So, there were quite a few prostitute-type goddesses and so forth. Anyway, so Paul is brought before these folks to explain to them what he's talking about, so that they will understand. And what he says, starting in verse 22, and going through to verse 34, what he's talking about here is considered the seminal sermon when witnessing to non-believers. Now, the cool thing about Paul is that Paul can switch on a dime the way that he talks, depending on who his audience is. When he's talking to Jews, He's going to be very heavy referring to the Old Testament and so on and so forth, showing them how the Old Testament leads up to Jesus, and Jesus leads to life. So he knows how to talk to Jews because he's a Jew. But he was born in Cilicia. And he's a Roman citizen. So he knows how to talk to Romans too. And he's very well educated because coming from Cilicia, there was a heavy Greek influence in that area. He knows how to talk to Greeks too. As he states in one of his epistles, I can't remember which one right offhand,
Yeah.
I have become all things to all men. He can talk to anybody, speaking their language, literally. And in this case, he not only uses very typical Greek rhetorical skills, but he also actually quotes from Greek poetry in order to get them to listen. Now, not a whole lot of converts came out of this, but honestly, when we're witnessing to non-believers, we don't get a whole lot of converts out of that either. But this is considered the outline to use when speaking to a complete non-believer who has absolutely no concept of God or anything like that. This is how you do it. And this is how he did it. And I think, yeah, we'll just start in 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens." Whoop, why do you say that? A lot of times he says, "Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen," that kind of thing. Men of Athens. The reason he says that is because the vast majority, if not all, of the people in the Areopagus that he's talking to, including the crowd that brought him there, were all men, for the most part. Some schools of philosophy allowed women to study in Athens, but not very many. We'll find that out in a little bit too. "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious." Now, this is one of the first things in Greek rhetoric, one of the first rules. When you're speaking to a crowd, you compliment them. And they would have considered this a compliment. However, this particular term, religious, in the Greek, can mean two things. It can be positive or negative. It can mean a very devout person, but it can also mean a very superstitious person. Now, the people who are listening to Paul, because of Greek rhetoric, you start out by complimenting the people who are listening to you, they would have taken this as a compliment. But Luke's readers will look at it as being an insult. It was a backhanded insult. Because being religious to something that doesn't exist, well, I think that's almost the very definition of being superstitious. "I perceive that in every way you are very religious, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship," notice how he says the objects of your worship, "I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.'" Okay. Let's kind of break this down. The objects of your worship at this particular time, because philosophy was on the rise, secularism was creeping its way into their society, just as it did ours. They, as I said, they had these statues, but the statues weren't the gods themselves. To the Greek in Athens, to the Athenian, that they weren't worshiping that stone statue. They were worshiping the god the statue represented. They could worship a god without a statue. They didn't need it. The God was there. The statue just reminded them that the God was there. And so, and unfortunately, a friend of mine, two friends of mine are currently in Rome, and they've been sending pictures from the Vatican, the Duomo, stuff like that. And inside the Duomo, there is a place at the in the roof from which a red light shines that is reputed to contain one of the nails from Jesus' cross. Yeah, you're shaking your head.
The icons.
The icons, exactly. Well, we're not worshiping the icon. The icon is just there to remind us that, these things happened, that Jesus did this, and these, like the Holy Grail and all of those kind of things. Let me explain something to you. As it was explained by Paul in Romans, we don't need those. God does not need that stuff, because all you have to do is open your eyes and look around at reality, and that shows you that God is there. All of creation declares His glory. He doesn't need any help. And I think, too, this is one of the reasons, that Christ went back up. Blessed are you who have seen me and believe, but more blessed is the person who has not seen me and still believes. Because if he'd stayed down here, well, there'd be a whole just bunch of people running around following him and worshiping him. He had stuff to do. As he said, I go to make a place for you. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. But he didn't need a whole bunch of people wandering around following him and worshiping him and stuff like that. He needed people to be his temple, his representative on earth. And for that he sent us a helper. I will send you a helper, which is the Holy Spirit. We are him down here, which is pretty cool. So, they don't have to have the statues, they don't have to have the icons, but they have the statues anyway. Paul, this is them splitting hairs, because as Paul points out, if you give a sacrifice to anything but God, you are sacrificing to demons. Okay? But Paul's not going to say that right out to these guys. His interest is not in ticking these people off. And unlike me, his interest is not in winning the argument. It's something I still struggle with. Mm-hmm. Oh, the struggles of me. What therefore you worship, to the unknown God. And there were a lot of unknown gods. This wasn't just one, they've got an altar to so-and-so, and Athena, and Apollo, and Zeus, and all these other, and here's one to the unknown God. No. Legend had it that a plague once struck Athens, and they sacrificed to every known god they could, and the plague did not go away. And so Epimenides of Crete suggested that they erect altars to unknown gods and sacrifice to them, just to cover all the bases. Now, think about this for a second. If there are a whole bunch of known gods, How many possible unknown gods are there? Again, going to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris is reputed to have counted all the way to infinity. Twice. That's how many unknown gods there could possibly be. The concept being that eventually we'll get the right one. We'll just start calling all these numbers, and eventually we'll get the right guy. Okay? That's how, and this is how Paul is looking at it too. But he's not saying it. Okay? That's the important thing. Okay. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Paul is again using Greek rhetoric, and he's seizing on a great point. You guys are worshiping this pantheon of gods and an unlimited pantheon of unknown gods. I'm going to tell you who he is. I'm going to narrow it down for you so you only have to dial one number. The God who made the world and everything in it. This would be a foreign concept to them. Different gods were responsible for different stuff. Okay? You had your water gods, you had your air gods, you had your rock gods, you had your mountain gods, you had your valley gods. Valley gods, of course, talk like, oh my gosh, those gods are just so crazy. You had all kinds of these different gods and goddesses and so forth. And this guy is talking about one God who made everything in it, being Lord, big L, Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Now here he's going to start using another Greek bit of rhetoric, logic. And this is another thing that Athenians greatly respected. If you're going to walk around here, don't be a babbler. Whatever you say had better make some kind of sense. Otherwise, we're going to tell you that you can no longer say what you've been saying. They did not have a First Amendment in Athens. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Even God himself has said this on occasion. Oh, you're going to make a house for me? You're going to help me. You're going to help me. Or when he was talking to Job. Oh, where were you when I made everything? I can't believe that I was able to do all this without Job's help. Nor is he served by human hands. He doesn't need our help. He's God. This brings up an interesting point applicable today with a certain religion that is currently and has been for a few decades now stirring up a lot of trouble, that believes that their God insists that everybody worship him or should be killed. Sounds downright barbaric. You know what it also tells me? Your God ain't that powerful then. If this is the God who made heaven and earth and all of us, and he wanted all of us to worship him, then he could have made us in such a way that we would. Now, either he does or he does not want us all to worship him, to be forced to worship him and follow his rules. If he does, then he could make it happen right now if he's all powerful. Why does he need your help to force other people to worship him? If he requires that kind of help, then he is obviously not all powerful. See? Logic. This is another reason why people who use a lot of logic and truth and so forth are killed almost immediately by certain types of philosophies and religions. Because if you talk too much logic and you start to point out the flaws in theirs, well, can't argue with that, let's just kill him. Oh, and we're doing it for our God, or our economic philosophy in some cases. Nor is he served by human hands, does not need our help, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. See, here's the logic. If he created us, and he provides everything for us, everything that we need, air, water, food, shelter, he made everything. Everything. Then how is it that he needs our help with anything? Don't think so. As I frequently point out to a hypothetical 5-year-old, let's say when a hypothetical 3-year-old has or has not done something that he is or is not supposed to do, and the hypothetical 5-year-old starts to correct him, or vice versa, it goes both ways, hypothetically. One of the first things we inform the hypothetical child is, we don't need your help. We don't need your help. Same thing applies here, except on a much grander scale. To the nth degree. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. This would conflict with an ancient belief, and this is, I'm doing a bit of a callback here. Remember how I told you that Athenians considered themselves more special than anybody else on the planet? More special than all other peoples? Because the ancient belief was that Athenians actually sprouted from the ground different from all other peoples, specially created. All of the original Athenians, by the way, not just one, but a whole bunch of people just sprouted up from the ground and made Athens. And they were special. So this concept that one man gave birth to every nation was a very foreign concept to them. Heck, just a monotheistic belief was kind of hard for them to grasp. Now the Stoics were for the most part monotheistic. And the concept that one man gave birth to all nations really worked well with their belief in like the brotherhood of all mankind kind of thing. So that was working with them. The philosophy of Stoicism very much overlapped with Jewish belief, which is why Jews were, treated with respect as if they were any other philosophy. And this is something that the Jews in Athens and in Greece generally tried to do, is show the similarities between their beliefs and the beliefs of the Greeks, because Jews very much accepted converts to them. And so what Paul is saying here for the Stoics, they would kind of dig that. They'd be, okay, one man, all nations. Another thing I would like to point out, from one man all nations came. That eliminates, 100% eliminates racism. Totally eliminates racism. We are from one blood. We are from one man descended. You cannot be a Christian and a racist. Well, you can, because I mean, you can be a Christian and be a jerk. It's possible. I've seen it. Some have accused me of it. But in reality, you can't be a racist. There's actually, I can't believe it took so long for this to occur, but I saw on Facebook there's going to be a conference on this very subject. And there's been more and more coming out about this, and I think because there is a certain segment of our society, and all over the world actually, that is stressing the division of races. The reason that they do this, of course, is, divide and conquer. If you can get people to hate each other, it doesn't matter for what reason. It could be as stupid as the color of your skin. Then, you have power over those groups of people. It's a strategy as old as time, which means it's one of Satan's best. Why does he keep using it? Because it works. Satan is not a dummy. He may be insane, but he's not a dummy. But right there, no more racism. Racism cannot exist if we're all from the same parentage. Cannot. Served by human hands, made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling places. Right here he is stressing God's sovereignty over not just the nations and their boundaries, but of all time, of history itself. He has control and sovereignty. But don't we have free will? Here we go again. Yeah. Yes, we do. Have you ever played chess against a chess master? I have. Okay? A chess master can see 20 moves ahead. He knows what you're going to do before you do it, and every move you make tells him more about what you're going to do and actually narrows down the possibilities of what you can do. And all he's doing is just sitting and watching, and he can actually manipulate your moves. Move a piece here, you have to respond in a certain way. If one of your pieces that you want to keep is under threat, you have to do something. God is the same way. Yeah, we have free will. We're just stupid. So how does he keep sovereignty over stuff? He just moves his pieces. Same thing. He knows what we're going to do before we do it. He actually has seen the end of the game. He knows how it ends. Which I'm sure would have made Avengers Endgame kind of a downer for him. I mean, he already knew what was going to happen. I thought it was awesome. Having determined allotted periods, epochs, and boundaries of their dwelling place. This is another thing too, when somebody says, well, if there's a real, true, loving God who wants us to love each other and so on and so forth, and there wouldn't be any borders or anything. We would just all come together and love each other and so on. And it says right here, he determined the boundaries of their nations. So yeah, nations need boundaries. That they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. What he's saying here is the Greek concept that he's putting out is almost walking around blind with your arms out, hoping that you'll come in contact with something, but you may or may not. He is, without necessarily them knowing it, talking about the Athenians themselves. They're just blindly erecting all these statues and all these gods and stuff, and well, that one time the gods didn't work out to us, so now we got to erect stuff to unknown gods, and there could be an infinite number of them. They're just flailing about in the dark. But they're looking. And that's what he's talking about here. They're looking, they're just not very focused about it. They're not looking in the right place. Yet he is actually not far from each of us. This was another thing that the Stoics would be kind of into, is that God's essence permeates everything, kind of like the Force. Okay? We've all got a little spark of divinity in us, that kind of thing. For, and here's a quote, "In him we live and move and have our being." Now, don't get all choked up yet. This is a quote from a poem written by Epimenides. Okay? And he actually uses it again in Titus. But he's using this poem that all of these folks would be familiar with so that they get the concept. This is not to say that he's a fan of Epimenides, because the poem was written about Zeus. But he's getting the concept across to them. Okay? As even some of your own poets have said, "For we are indeed his offspring." And I believe, if I remember correctly, this quote, I'm not sure if it came from the same poem or because there's another poet from Cilicia where Paul is from, called Aratus or something like that. And I think that might be a quote from one of his. "Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man." Now he's starting to cut a little bit, because he's cutting away at that. You remember how I told you they're kind of splitting hairs by saying, well, that statue doesn't actually look like Apollo. It's just there in an artistic interpretation to remind us of Apollo. And he's kind of cutting into that right now, saying that it's an image formed by art and imagination of man. Not only can you not build a temple for God, a house for him, such that he can be contained in it, you certainly can't, through any kind of art whatsoever, even come close to describing him and his glory. One of my favorite things to say when I see something especially pretty in nature is, "God, you sure can paint." Now, I do appreciate art. I have a particular thing for the Impressionists, because that's what everything looks like to me when I take my glasses off. But there's nothing that could be made by the hands of men that could come anywhere close, do any kind of justice to God's glory. Can't build him a house, and you sure as heck can't paint him or build a statue of him. You can't contain his awesomeness. Like, even in your imagination, you can't even conceive of it. God himself said, if a regular man looks at me in the face, he dies. Okay, the times of ignorance God overlooked. Okay, now he's kind of cutting a little bit more. He's saying ignorance. He's not saying you're ignorant directly. But here he's also stressing the point that God is very patient and gracious. The times of ignorance God overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent. This is a command we can either obey or not. And if we don't, well, let's see what happens next. Because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. This kind of answers the whole, oh, well, you Christians are supposed to be all tolerant and forgiving and so on and so forth and not be judging and so on and so forth, blah, 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 blah. Let me get this straight. Jesus was and is a very loving and forgiving individual. But that will not go on forever. There is an appointed time where he will say, just as I do usually around bedtime, I have had enough of this. I don't have anywhere close to the patience that God has. My fixed time of judgment is usually about 7:30 p.m. every night.
I think that's universal.
Yeah. But there will be judgment, and the judgment will come from a man, just like all men or from one man descended. All men will be judged by one man. Who is he to judge us? Well, other than, perfect and God and stuff. You can liken it to the TV show with Gordon Ramsay, where he goes and rescues the various restaurants. And a lot of times, somebody will, who are you? Oh, well, I've only got, hundreds of restaurants all over the world, and they've won like 5 Michelin stars and that kind of stuff. That's who I am. Mm-hmm. And Jesus has a lot more pull than Gordon Ramsay does. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Let me tell you why. Greek, unlike Jewish belief, Greek philosophies, for the most part, did not have an eschatological end to the world. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing, this resurrection from the dead. Now, again, when I told you he was talking about resurrection in the marketplace, they mistook it for a female's name, a woman's name, which is why he changed his phraseology here. Raised from the dead. He didn't use the term resurrection. He said, raised this person from the dead. This is a concept extremely foreign to them. If the individual Athenian did believe in an afterlife, there were basically one of two options. Depending on the philosophy that you happen to be a part of. Either your spirit kind of floated through an ethereal netherworld, or it went straight up to heaven, having been released from this mortal coil. But there was no such thing as a bodily resurrection. To suggest such a thing, the concept that would come into the Athenian's mind is somewhere along the lines of Night of the Living Dead, where corpses would become animated and start walking around in the world of the living. That's what they're hearing when he says this. That's what they're thinking when he says this, because they didn't have this day of judgment, afterlife. A lot of these people didn't even believe in an afterlife. You die, you're dead. That's it. Again, like I said, they were trending towards secularism here. Some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this," which is good. And that's what happens when I'm online talking to atheists and stuff. The vast majority of them just make fun of me, call me all kinds of names and stuff like that, and turn their backs and walk away, to which I shake off the dust of my feet and say, okay, well, good luck with that. You're going to need it, especially when we're gone. But some of them actually, say, oh, that's interesting. No, we'll come back and talk about it later. And sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they ask more, sometimes they don't. This is something that we need to be cognizant of when we're witnessing to somebody too. We cannot, well, we can, but it won't work, grab them by the lapels and say, Jesus loves you, and you need to repent and follow him. The type of reaction, especially in the United States, anywhere in the West really, but especially in the United States, if you did that to somebody, and even more especially in Texas, you could get shot. Certainly a good beating would be in order. Okay? Nobody is going to listen to that. Or very, very, very few people will listen to that approach. The approach that we take, most of the time we don't even know we're doing it. It's just people watching us every day. Our behavior. What we say, what we do. They're not won over by logic most of the time. Why? Because most people don't use logic. It's not an everyday part of their life, especially nowadays. I read an article yesterday that talked about how logic is all but gone and has been replaced by feelings. Yeah, fickle feelings. But there are some people who will actually listen. Not many, but there are some. Some men joined him and believed, among whom were also Dionysius the Areopagite. So he was one of the town council members. So he had 1 out of 100. Now, understand this. This is another thing, very important. We don't keep score. God rejoices, the angels rejoice over one sinner who repents as much as they do 100 or 1,000. Jesus talked about it. How many of you will stay home and sit around and do nothing if one of your lambs from your flock gets away? No. You're going to go out and you're going to find that lamb. And when you find the lamb, you're going to rejoice. So just one is cause for as much rejoice as 1,000. So whenever you're sitting around thinking to yourself, oh, I'm no Billy Graham. No, you're not Billy Graham. Billy Graham is Billy Graham. Was Billy Graham. No, is. Billy Graham is Billy Graham. He's just not here.
Right.
He's in a much happier place. And a woman named Damaris and others with them. So he got a few. But not many. But that's to be expected by a society that's primarily going secular, like ours. So that not only, I think, is a very good outline for how to approach those who are non-believers and completely unfamiliar with Christianity, but it's an apt indication of what the results are going to be. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening, both of you.